If he lost his job tomorrow, he had no idea how he would explain it to his child tonight. The email sat unread on his phone, vibrating like a warning he wasn't ready to face. In 48 hours, one meeting would decide whether his life stayed intact or quietly collapsed. Across the city, the woman who would judge him was deciding how many people had to disappear to keep her company alive. Neither of them knew yet that this decision would change far more than a balance sheet. He was a single father who had learned to measure time in school drop-offs, unpaid bills, and sleepless nights. Every morning he packed lunch with the precision of someone who could not afford mistakes, then went to work pretending he wasn't afraid. He wasn't lazy, reckless, or incompetent. He was tired in a way rest could never fix. For years, he had done everything right and still felt replaceable, like a name that could vanish from a system with a one click. The upcoming evaluation wasn't just about performance. It was about survival. At the center of it all stood the CEO, a woman known for discipline, clarity, and decisions that never hesitated. To the world, she was power in motion, a leader who built success by cutting inefficiency wherever it appeared. To herself, she was something else entirely. She had spent years winning battles she no longer remembered choosing, guided more by expectations than purpose. Now the board demanded layoffs, numbers demanded sacrifices, and her conscience demanded answers. When she approved the new review process, she told herself it was necessary, nothing personal. Then she read one anonymous employee statement and attached to the meeting agenda. It wasn't angry or dramatic. It was quiet, honest, and terrifyingly human. It spoke about fear, about children, about the cost of being invisible. By the time they finally stood in the same room, both believed they were there to defend themselves. He didn't remember the last morning that didn't start with calculation. Not numbers exactly, not in the way accountants love them, but calculations all the same. How many minutes until he had to wake his child? How much time he could spare before work? Whether the food in the fridge would stretch until Friday? Whether today would be the day something finally broke? The alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., the same dull sound it had made for years. He silenced it before it could ring twice, careful not to wake the small figure sleeping in the next room. For a moment, he sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor, as if answers might be hiding there. Then he stood up. He always stood up. In the kitchen, the light flickered before settling. He poured cereal into a bowl, added milk, then hesitated and poured a little back into the carton. He packed a lunch with mechanical precision. Sandwich apple, a note with a badly drawn smiley face. The note was the most important part. It always was. His child shuffled in, hair messy, eyes half open. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, buddy," he said, forcing energy into his voice. They sat together at the small table. His child talked about school, about a science project, about a classmate who never listened. He nodded, smiled, asked questions, storing every detail away, like something precious. These minutes mattered. He knew that in a way he felt in his bones. What he didn't say was that his phone had buzzed twice already. An email from work, then another. He didn't open them. After drop-off, he sat in the car for a long moment before starting the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, gripping tighter than necessary. 48 hours. That was the timeline the message had promised. A final review. A strategic alignment meeting. Polite words that felt like a quiet execution notice. At the office, nothing looked different, which somehow made it worse. The same gray carpet, the same hum of printers, the same faces moving past him with coffee cups and forced smiles. People laughed in the break room. Someone complained about the weather. Life went on as if nothing was about to end. He sat at his desk and logged in. His work was good. He knew that. He always met deadlines, caught mistakes, fixed problems before they reached clients. But he wasn't loud. He didn't push himself forward. He didn't have the energy for office politics. When you went home to an empty apartment except for a child who needed you whole, there wasn't much left to perform ambition. By mid-morning, whispers moved through the floor. Did you hear? They're cutting teams. My manager says it's bad this time. He kept his head down. That was his survival instinct. Don't draw attention. Don't give them a reason. But the email arrived anyway. Mandatory attendance, executive review, CEO present. His stomach twisted. He had never spoken to her directly. He had seen her, of course, everyone had. She appeared on screens during company-wide updates, voice calm, eyes sharp, posture perfect. She talked about vision, efficiency, future-proofing. People applauded. Some admired her. Others feared her. To him, she was an abstraction, a distant authority who existed far above the level where individual lives mattered. Until now. On the top floor of the same building, the day began very differently. The office was quiet, soundproofed from the rest of the company. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a controlled experiment. Everything here was deliberate. The furniture, the lighting, even the silence. The CEO stood near the window, coffee untouched on the table behind her. She had been awake since 4. Not because of stress exactly. Stress implied panic, and she rarely panicked. It was something colder than that, something heavier. A sense of being pulled in directions that no longer aligned with who she thought she was supposed to be. The board documents glowed on her tablet. Charts, projections, risk assessments, reductions. Layoffs weren't new. She had approved them before, justified them with logic that had once felt clean and necessary. You cut to save the whole. You sacrifice parts so the system survives. That was leadership. That was what she had been praised for. Yet lately, the words tasted wrong. Public perception was shifting. Articles questioned the company's culture. Anonymous comments called leadership detached, inhuman. The board wanted reassurance. Investors wanted numbers. Everyone wanted certainty. She felt none. The review process had been her compromise, a way to show the board she was serious while telling herself she was still fair. Each department would submit evaluations. Employees could submit anonymous statements. A gesture toward humanity, she told herself, a controlled outlet. She hadn't planned to read them all, but one had caught her attention. It wasn't dramatic, no accusations, no anger. Just a quiet description of fear, of being a parent, of counting hours and paychecks, of doing everything right and still feeling disposable. It ended with a single sentence. I don't need to be special. I just need to know that doing my best is enough to keep my child safe. She had stared at the screen longer than she meant to. Now, standing by the window, she wondered why it had unsettled her so deeply. She had grown up believing emotion was a liability, that caring too much made decisions messy. She had learned to succeed by being precise, controlled, untouchable. But lately, the victories felt hollow. Her assistant knocked softly. They're ready when you are. She nodded, squared her shoulders, and turned away from the window. Power, she reminded herself, was about making hard choices. The conference room felt too bright. He took a seat near the end of the table, hands folded, back straight. Around him, others sat in similar postures, pretending this was just another meeting. No one spoke much. The air was thick with anticipation and dread. Then she walked in. The room changed instantly. She didn't need to announce herself. Her presence did that on its own. Calm, focused, controlled. She acknowledged the room with a brief nod and took her seat at the head of the table. He avoided looking at her directly at first. The meeting began with numbers. Slides clicked by. Departments were discussed as units, as costs, as efficiencies. He listened, understanding more than he wanted to. His team's name appeared on the screen, a downward arrow, a recommendation. His heart pounded. Then came the unexpected. We'll begin with employee input, she said. There was one statement I'd like addressed. The room shifted, heads turned, people sat straighter. She read it aloud. His breath caught halfway through. It was his. He had written it late one night, sitting at the kitchen table after his child had fallen asleep. He hadn't signed it. He hadn't expected anyone to really read it. Now it filled the room. When she finished, silence stretched. She looked around the table. I'd like to hear from the person who wrote this. Panic surged. His first instinct was to stay quiet, to let the moment pass, to protect himself, but something else rose up, something tired and heavy and honest. He raised his hand. For the first time since the meeting started, she looked directly at him, not past him, not over him, at him. Yes, she said, please. He stood slowly, legs unsteady. My name is... He stopped, swallowed. I work in operations. He didn't plead. He didn't argue numbers. He talked about his child, about working late, about fear, about wanting to do well without being loud about it, about how invisible effort still mattered. When he finished, the room was silent again. She studied him, expression unreadable. Thank you, she said finally. Please sit. As he lowered himself back into his chair, he felt exposed, vulnerable, and strangely lighter. On the other side of the table, she felt something shift. This wasn't a statistic. This was a human being. And for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't sure which decision would cost her more. The meeting ended without a clear verdict, which somehow felt worse than bad news. People filed out of the conference room in silence, chairs scraping softly against the floor, eyes carefully avoiding one another. Conversations resumed only once the doors closed behind them, low and cautious, like whispers in a hospital hallway. He remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the blank screen at the front of the room, his pulse still racing. He had spoken, really spoken. And now there was no taking it back. When he finally stood, his legs felt weak, as if the floor beneath him had shifted without warning. He told himself that at least it was done, that whatever happened next would happen whether he worried or not. But fear was not a rational thing. It followed him down the hallway, clung to him in the elevator, sat beside him when he returned to his desk. Almost immediately, he felt it. The glances, not overt, not cruel, but different, curious, measuring. A few coworkers smiled at him with something like admiration. Others looked away too quickly, their expressions tightening. Someone leaned over and whispered, "That was brave. That was brave." Brave was not what he wanted to be. Brave didn't pay rent. Brave didn't guarantee stability. Brave didn't help when a child needed certainty more than courage. By lunchtime, the mood on the floor had shifted. Rumors spread fast in an office built on uncertainty. Some people speculated that he had just saved his team. Others suggested he had signed his own termination letter. His manager didn't say a word. That silence felt deliberate. In the afternoon, he was called into a smaller meeting. No executives this time, just middle management and HR representatives who spoke in careful phrases. They thanked him for his honesty, reminded him of company values, and gently suggested that emotional framing could be misinterpreted in professional settings. "We appreciate passion," one of them said, hands folded neatly on the table, "but we also have to maintain objectivity." He nodded, apologized even, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. When he returned to his desk, his inbox held a new message. Subject: follow-up, required no sender name. He recognized. Just a calendar invite. He didn't accept it right away. On the executive floor, the atmosphere was equally tense, though for entirely different reasons. The CEO sat alone in her office, jacket draped over the back of her chair, sleeves rolled up. The meeting replayed in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. The room, the silence, the way his voice had trembled only slightly, controlled but honest. She had seen many employees speak before, some angry, some desperate, some rehearsed. This had been none of those things. It had been quiet truth. Her tablet buzzed with messages from board members before the meeting even officially concluded. Questions, concerns, warnings disguised as advice. One message stood out. We need to discuss the precedent you're setting. She exhaled slowly. Precedent. As if empathy were a dangerous contagion. She knew what they were afraid of, that allowing stories like his into decision-making would complicate things, that numbers would become faces and faces would make cuts harder, that control would slip. In her world, control was everything. She walked to the window again, looking down at the city far below. Somewhere in that maze of streets, millions of people were balancing lives just as fragile as the one she had heard about an hour earlier. She had built her career on ignoring that reality, on abstracting it into charts and forecasts. Now abstraction felt dishonest. Her assistant knocked lightly and entered, tablet in hand. The board wants an emergency call this evening, she said carefully. They're concerned. I imagine they are, the CEO replied. And there's one more thing, her assistant added. Middle management flagged the employee who spoke today. They're asking how to proceed. The CEO turned. Flagged how? They're worried he disrupted protocol. They want guidance. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, send me his file. The next few days passed in a haze. At home, he tried to maintain normalcy. Dinner, homework, bedtime stories. He laughed at the right moments, listened attentively, nodded reassuringly when his child asked if everything was okay. Yes, he said. Everything's fine. It was a lie told with love. At night, when the apartment was quiet, the worry crept back in. He replayed the meeting over and over, dissecting every word he had said. He wondered if he should have stayed silent, if protecting his child meant never being honest about fear. On the third day, his manager finally spoke to him. Look, she said, closing her office door. I don't think you did anything wrong, but you need to understand how this works. You made people uncomfortable. I didn't mean to. I know, she interrupted gently, but intention doesn't matter as much as impact. Right now, eyes are on you. That can go either way. He left her office feeling smaller than when he'd entered. That afternoon, the calendar invite reappeared, updated with urgency. Executive floor, private discussion. His hands shook as he accepted it. She had spent the morning arguing, not raising her voice, not losing composure, but pushing back in the way she knew best, with clarity, with questions no one wanted to answer. What exactly is the problem? She asked the board through a video screen. That an employee spoke honestly, or that what he said resonated. They spoke about optics, about investor confidence, about how leadership required distance. Distance from what? She asked. No one answered directly. When the call ended, nothing was resolved. They hadn't overruled her, but they hadn't supported her either. It was a stalemate, and she was keenly aware of how fragile her position suddenly felt. Still, she made her decision. When he arrived on the executive floor, he felt like he didn't belong. The carpet was thicker here, the lighting softer. Everything about the space suggested importance, separation. Her assistant led him to the office and closed the door behind him. The CEO stood as he entered. Thank you for coming, she said. He nodded, unsure whether to sit or stand. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. I want to be clear, she began. This is not a disciplinary meeting. That surprised him. Then why? Because what you said matters, she said, interrupting him gently, and because it has consequences. He swallowed. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I know, she replied. That's precisely why it did. She studied him for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. You understand that what you did puts you at risk, she continued, not officially, but informally. People don't like to feel exposed. He nodded slowly. I understand. Good, she said. Then you'll understand why I'm offering you something instead of protection. He frowned slightly. I'm not sure I follow. There's a pilot project we're launching, she said, but Small team, limited visibility. It's meant to explore restructuring without layoffs. It will fail if people treat it like a safe assignment. And you want me on it? He asked. I want you to help shape it, she corrected. No promises, no shortcuts, just work. His heart pounded. This wasn't the rescue he had secretly hoped for. It was risk layered on top of risk. Why me? He asked. She hesitated, then answered honestly. Because you reminded me what's actually at stake. He considered that. And if it fails? He asked quietly. Then nothing changes, she said. And we both live with that. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the choice settling between them. At home, his child needed certainty. At work, certainty was the one thing no one could offer. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it. She nodded once, a flicker of something like respect in her eyes. As he stood to leave, she added, for what it's worth, speaking today was the harder choice. He paused at the door, then left. Alone again, she stared at the closed door longer than necessary. For the first time in years, she had chosen complication over control, and she wasn't sure whether that made her brave or reckless. The first week of the pilot project felt like standing in the middle of a storm no one else could see. On paper, nothing had changed. He still arrived at the same time, sat at the same desk, logged into the same systems. But the space around him had shifted subtly, like a room after an argument when everyone pretends nothing happened. He was no longer invisible. Some colleagues watched him with cautious curiosity, as if he were carrying something contagious. Others avoided him altogether, their friendliness replaced by polite distance. A few tried to align themselves with him, offering help that felt less like kindness and more like positioning. He didn't want any of it. The project itself was demanding in a way that left no room for distraction. It wasn't a theoretical exercise or a symbolic initiative. The goal was brutally clear: find a way to restructure workflows without cutting people loose. That meant inefficiencies had to be addressed honestly, and honesty was expensive. He worked late most nights, long after the building emptied. The office lights dimmed automatically at 9, forcing him to turn them back on manually, a small act of defiance against the quiet expectation that he should already be gone. At home, his child noticed. "You're tired," they said one evening as he tucked them into bed. "I'm okay," he replied, smoothing their hair. "You always say that." He smiled faintly. Children had a way of seeing through practiced answers. Still, he kissed their forehead and promised he'd be home earlier soon. He hoped it wasn't another lie. For the CEO, the pressure came faster and harder. By the second week, the board's patience was thinning. Emails grew sharper, meetings shorter. She was asked to justify decisions that had once been assumed correct. Her authority wasn't gone, but it was being tested, pulled apart, thread by thread. "You're investing time and resources into a project with no guaranteed return," one board member said during a call. "That's not strategic leadership." "It's long-term leadership," she replied calmly. "Long-term doesn't help us next quarter." That was always the problem. The future only mattered when it didn't threaten the present. Privately, doubts crept in. She reviewed progress reports late at night, scanning data, while her office lights reflected faintly in the glass. The numbers were promising, but not miraculous. Incremental improvements, potential pathways, nothing she could point to and say, "This is worth the risk." And the risk was growing. Articles appeared online questioning her recent decisions. Anonymous sources whispered about internal dissent. The narrative was forming without her consent, and it painted her as indecisive, distracted by sentiment. She had fought hard to escape that label early in her career. Women in power were rarely allowed softness without consequence. She knew the rules. She had played by them for years. Now she was breaking them. The collision came on a Thursday morning. He was called into his manager's office again, this time without warning. HR was already there, faces carefully neutral. "We've had concerns raised," the HR representative began. "About what?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. About your role on the pilot project. Some feel your involvement creates bias. He frowned. Bias toward what? Toward emotional considerations, his manager said, not unkindly. People think you're too close to the issue. He almost laughed. Almost. This project is about people, he said carefully. How can that be a flaw? It's not, HR replied quickly. But perception matters. There it was again, not truth, not outcomes, perception. They didn't remove him from the project, but they restricted his authority, adding layers of approval that slowed everything down. By the time he left the room, he felt the familiar weight of futility pressing down on him. That evening, his phone rang as he was leaving the office. Her name appeared on the screen. He hesitated before answering. Yes? I heard what happened, she said without preamble. Then you know it's fine, he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. It's not fine, she said. They're undermining the work. He leaned against the wall, exhaustion flooding him. This is what happens when you speak up. I knew that. I didn't, she said quietly. Not like this. There was a pause, thick with unspoken tension. I won't blame you if you want out, she continued. I put you in the spotlight without shielding you from the fallout. He closed his eyes. I can't afford to leave. I know. That was the cruel truth of it. She had chosen complication. He was living inside it. The breaking point came unexpectedly, not at work, but at school. The call came in the middle of a meeting, his phone buzzing insistently in his pocket. He ignored it at first, then excused himself when it rang again. His child's teacher was calm, but the words hit hard. There had been an incident, another student, hurtful comments, escalation. Your child is safe, the teacher assured him, but they're very upset. He left the building without explanation, heart pounding, mind racing. At the school, his child sat in the office, shoulders hunched, eyes red. When they saw him, they ran into his arms, clutching him tightly. Between sobs, the story came out, being teased for wearing old shoes, for always being tired, for having a dad who was always busy. The words cut deeper than any email ever could. That night, after his child finally fell asleep, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the project documents open on his laptop. Numbers blurred together. Strategies felt meaningless. What was the point of fighting a system if it still stole time from the person who mattered most? He drafted an email, deleted it, drafted another, resignation, temporary leave, something vague enough to sound professional. Before he could send it, another message arrived from her. Can we talk? She was still in the office when he arrived, though it was well past 9. Her jacket lay discarded on a chair, hair slightly out of place, the polished image cracked just enough to reveal the person underneath. He told her everything about the school, the teasing, the guilt, the exhaustion that no longer felt manageable. I don't think I can do this, he said finally. Not like this. She listened without interrupting, hands folded, expression serious. When he finished, she stood and walked to the window, back turned to him. I need to tell you something, she said after a moment. The board gave me an ultimatum today. His chest tightened. What kind? End the pilot project or step aside? The words hung heavy in the air. You're choosing me over your job? He asked, incredulous. I'm choosing responsibility, she corrected. The kind that doesn't show up on quarterly reports. He shook his head. That's not fair. You shouldn't lose everything because of me. She turned to face him. This isn't about you. It's about whether I can keep pretending that leadership means ignoring consequences. Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. What happens if you step aside? He asked. They'll install someone more compliant, she said. The layoffs will proceed, quietly, efficiently. And the project? It dies? He swallowed hard. Then end it, he said softly. I can't be the reason. She cut him off. You're not the reason, you're the reminder. She took a breath, steadying herself. I built this company believing I could control outcomes if I was disciplined enough, she continued. I was wrong. Control without conscience is just another kind of failure. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not power, but vulnerability. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to make the choice I can live with, she said. The announcement came the following week. She stood before the company, composed but visibly altered, and spoke about values, responsibility, and the limits of growth at any cost. She announced her resignation, effective immediately, citing the need for leadership aligned with the company's direction. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Markets dipped. Commentators speculated. Employees whispered in hallways. He watched from his desk, stunned. She had chosen, and now everything was uncertain. As he packed up his things that evening, unsure whether he even still had a job, his phone buzzed with a final message from her. No matter what happens next, it read, You mattered. He stared at the screen, heart heavy and strangely hopeful. For the first time, neither of them knew what the future held, but they both knew the cost of choosing differently. The building felt different once she was gone. Not quieter. If anything, it was louder. Meetings multiplied. Emails flew faster. Voices carried sharper edges. Change had a way of doing that. It unsettled people, exposed fault lines that had always been there but rarely acknowledged. For him, the days after her resignation blurred together. No one officially told him what would happen next. The pilot project was under review, a phrase so vague it might as well have meant nothing at all. His access wasn't revoked, but no one asked him for updates either. It was as if the system had paused, waiting to decide whether he still existed within it. He came to work anyway. Routine was easier than thinking. He dropped his child off at school, promised he'd be home on time, and drove to the office with a knot in his stomach that never quite loosened. At his desk, he finished tasks no one assigned, answered emails that might not matter, and waited. For a call, for an answer, for the other shoe to drop. It didn't, not immediately. Instead, a week passed, then another. Layoffs were announced in waves, careful and controlled. His department was hit, though not as deeply as projected. Some faces disappeared overnight, desks emptied, people left plants behind. Survivor's guilt settled into him like a second skin. At home, the consequences were impossible to ignore. His child watched him closely, picking up on tension even when he tried to hide it. Are you mad at your work? They asked one evening. No, he said automatically, then paused. I'm disappointed. With who? He thought about that for a moment. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe with myself. Across the city, she woke up to silence. No notifications, no calendar alerts, no assistant waiting outside her door. For the first time in years, her day belonged entirely to her, and the freedom was unsettling. She had prepared for this moment in theory, financially, strategically, but not emotionally. The identity she had worn for so long didn't disappear just because she stepped away from it. It lingered in habits, in expectations, in the reflex to check her phone for messages that would never come. She took long walks through the city, blending into crowds that didn't recognize her. She sat in cafes without laptops, listening to fragments of other people's conversations. Ordinary life unfolded around her, messy and unoptimized. It was strangely comforting and terrifying. She had told herself she would take time before making any decisions, rest, reflect, recover. But clarity didn't arrive neatly packaged. It crept in slowly, accompanied by doubt. Had she made the right choice? The articles were unforgiving. Some praised her integrity. Others called her naive, emotional, reckless. A former colleague sent a brief message. You could have waited this out. She read it more than once, then she deleted it. On a quiet afternoon, she found herself opening her laptop and pulling up old project files. The pilot framework, the notes, his contributions, the ideas that had never been fully realized. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she reached for her phone. When his phone rang that evening, he almost didn't answer. It had been a long day, one of those days where exhaustion felt baked into his bones. His child was already asleep, curled up with a book they hadn't finished reading. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He saw her name and froze. "Hello?" he said cautiously. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "No," he replied. No, it's fine." There was a pause, awkward and unfamiliar. They had never spoken without the weight of hierarchy pressing down between them. "I wanted to check in," she said finally. "Not as anything official, just as a person." He leaned back in his chair. "That's new territory for both of us." She laughed softly. "It is." They talked carefully at first, about work, about how things had unfolded, about the project being quietly dismantled. She listened as he described the layoffs, the uncertainty, the feeling of waiting for a verdict that might never come. "I'm sorry," she said when he finished. "I know," he replied, and for once it wasn't bitter. After a moment, she said, "I keep thinking about what we started, about what it could have been if the conditions were different." He hesitated. "Conditions are always different," he said. "That's the problem." "Yes," she agreed, "but sometimes different doesn't mean impossible." She told him about her days now, the quiet, the doubt, the strange relief of no longer having to be certain all the time. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, "but I do know I don't want to walk away from the work unfinished." "You don't have a company anymore," he said gently. "I don't need one," she replied. "Not the way I did before." Silence stretched between them, charged with possibility. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting we keep working," she said, "without titles, without permission, see what happens." His first instinct was to say no. He couldn't afford uncertainty. He needed stability, predictability, a paycheck that arrived on time. Dreams didn't put food on the table. Ideas didn't pay rent. But something in her voice stopped him. Not confidence, not authority, honesty. "How?" he asked. She smiled, though he couldn't see it. "We start small, consulting, independent work. You know the systems, I know the strategy. We test ideas where they're welcome instead of forcing them where they're not." "And if it fails?" he asked. "Then it fails," she said. "And at least this time, we'll know why." He looked around his apartment, the mismatched furniture, the stack of bills on the counter, the closed door to his child's room. "Let me think about it," he said. "Of course," she replied. "Take your time." After they hung up, he sat in silence for a long while. Then he opened his laptop. Their first meeting took place in a small rented workspace that smelled faintly of coffee and dust. No security badges, no reserved parking, just two people sitting across from each other at a scratched table, laptops open, notebooks scattered between them. It was uncomfortable at first. Without roles to define them, they had to negotiate everything. Who spoke first? Whose ideas took precedence? How decisions were made? Old habits surfaced. She caught herself defaulting to authority. He caught himself deferring when he shouldn't. They adjusted slowly. They argued, sometimes heatedly, about priorities, about risk, about how much compromise was too much. But something unexpected happened. They listened. Without an audience, without pressure from above, the work felt different, lighter, more honest. They tested ideas with smaller organizations, nonprofits, companies willing to experiment. Some said no, some said maybe, a few said yes. The first contract wasn't large, but it was enough to justify the effort, enough to keep going. At home, he explained the change to his child carefully. "I'm doing something new," he said. "It might be a little scary at first." "Are you still going to be busy?" they asked. He thought about that. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I'll be here when it matters." They considered this, then nodded. "Okay." It was the closest thing to approval he could hope for. Weeks passed, then months. The work grew slowly, organically. Word spread. People talked about the former CEO who had walked away from power and the single dad who understood systems from the inside out. Their approach wasn't flashy, it was practical, human. They didn't promise miracles. They promised effort. Late one evening, after finishing a proposal together, they sat back in their chairs, exhausted but satisfied. "This is harder than running a company," she said. He laughed. "And somehow simpler." She looked at him, really looked at him, and smiled. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me." He hesitated, then replied, "Thank you for choosing differently." They sat in comfortable silence, the city humming softly outside the window. Neither of them knew exactly where this path would lead, but for the first time they were walking it without fear of falling from a position they no longer needed. They were building something fragile, and that somehow felt stronger than anything they'd had before. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, quiet and ordinary in the way disasters often are. He was reviewing a draft proposal at the shared workspace, the low hum of conversation around him blending into background noise. She sat across the table, focused, brow slightly furrowed as she annotated a document. It was one of their better days, productive, calm, almost hopeful. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, expecting a school update or a reminder he'd forgotten to silence. Instead, he saw the school's number. A sharp, instinctive fear rose in his chest. "Sorry," he had said, already standing. "I need to take this." She nodded immediately, concern flickering across her face. He stepped into the hallway and answered, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was measured but tense. There had been an incident. His child had collapsed during recess, dizzy, disoriented. An ambulance had been called as a precaution. They were on the way to the hospital now. He didn't remember hanging up. He grabbed his coat, hand shaking, mind racing through worst-case scenarios he couldn't stop. She was at his side in seconds. "What happened?" she asked. "Hospital," he said, the word barely forming. "I'm coming," she said without hesitation. "I don't want to. I'm coming," she repeated, already reaching for her bag. The ride was a blur. Traffic lights felt like obstacles placed deliberately in their way. He replayed the last few weeks in his head, searching for signs he might have missed. The fatigue, the quieter mornings, the way his child had brushed off headaches with a shrug. Guilt pressed down on him like a weight. At the hospital, time stretched and fractured. Doctors asked questions he struggled to answer. Tests were ordered, forms signed. He sat in a plastic chair outside a curtained room, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles ached. She stayed close but didn't intrude. She fetched water, spoke softly to nurses, handled logistics he couldn't focus on. When he finally broke, head in hands, shoulders shaking, she didn't say anything at all. She simply sat beside him, solid and present. Hours passed. Finally, a doctor approached. It wasn't life-threatening, not immediately, but it wasn't nothing either. Severe exhaustion compounded by stress. Warning signs they couldn't ignore. More tests would follow. Changes would need to be made. "Your child needs rest," the doctor said gently. "Consistency, less strain." He nodded, though the words blurred together. Rest, consistency. He thought about late nights, about promises he hadn't kept, about a life that demanded flexibility he no longer had. When they were finally alone, his child slept peacefully, small chest rising and falling with each breath. He sat beside the bed, watching, afraid to look away. "She'll be okay," she said quietly. He didn't answer. Later in the hallway, he spoke the thought he had been holding back. "I can't do this anymore." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean all of it," he said, voice tight. "The juggling, the risk, the pretending everything will work out if I just try harder." He leaned against the wall, exhaustion flooding through him. "I thought leaving the company would give me more control," he continued, "but I've just traded one kind of instability for another, And now, he gestured helplessly toward the room. Now it's costing her. She listened, face serious, eyes steady. What are you saying? She asked. He swallowed. I'm saying I need to stop. The consulting, the late nights, the uncertainty. I need something smaller, safer. The words tasted like failure. She nodded slowly. That makes sense. He looked at her, surprised. You're not going to argue? No, she said, because this isn't about ambition. It's about responsibility. Relief and sadness tangled in his chest. I don't know what that means for us, he admitted. She took a breath. Neither do I. In the days that followed, reality settled in. His child was released from the hospital with strict instructions, reduced stress, regular routines, follow-ups, no shortcuts. He adjusted immediately, turned down work, canceled meetings, set firm boundaries he had once believed were impossible. Money became tighter. Fear returned in new forms, but something else changed too. Evenings grew quieter, mornings slower. He walked his child to school instead of rushing through drop-off. They talked more, laughed more. He noticed things he had missed before. Still, the weight of the decision lingered. One evening, after his child had gone to bed, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop. An email from a former colleague sat unread in his inbox. A potential job, stable, predictable. Less meaningful, perhaps, but safe. He hadn't told her about it yet. Across town, she sat in her apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes she still hadn't decided what to do with. Her days had grown strangely full. Meetings, calls, planning sessions, but tonight felt hollow. The consulting work had slowed without him pushing it forward. She could have taken control, driven things harder, filled the gap. She didn't. Instead, she kept thinking about the hospital hallway, about the way his voice had cracked, about the clarity in his choice. For years, she had defined sacrifice as something other people did. Now she wondered what it meant to truly choose. When her phone buzzed, she answered immediately. I need to talk to you, he said. So do I, she replied. They met at a quiet park near the hospital, a neutral space that felt safe. Night had settled in, cool and calm, the city lights softened by distance. He told her about the email, the job offer, the possibility of stepping away completely. I haven't accepted it, he said, but I might. She nodded, absorbing the words. I won't lie, she said. That scares me. Me too, he admitted. She took a breath, then spoke carefully. I started this work because I wanted to fix something, she said. But somewhere along the way, it became about proving I could. He watched her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. I don't need to prove that anymore, she continued. If you need to step back, then I need to ask myself why I'm still pushing forward. He frowned slightly. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe the answer isn't for you to choose safety alone, she said, or for me to choose purpose alone. Maybe the real question is what we're willing to give up to protect what matters. Silence settled between them. What would you give up? He asked quietly. She met his gaze. Control. The word hung heavy. For the first time in my life, she continued, I don't want to build something that costs people their health, or their childhood, or their peace, including yours. He looked away, emotion tightening his throat. I don't want you to resent me, he said, or this. I won't, she replied softly, but only if we're honest. They sat there for a long time, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Finally, he spoke. I'll take the job, he said. For now, stability matters. She nodded. And I'll pause the consulting work, not end it, just let it breathe. He looked back at her. You don't have to do that. I know, she said. I want to. Something shifted then. Not dramatically, not romantically, but fundamentally. This wasn't rescue. This wasn't sacrifice in the old sense. This was alignment. They stood to leave, walking slowly toward the parking lot. What happens to us? He asked. She smiled faintly. We keep choosing, one decision at a time. For the first time since the hospital, the knot in his chest loosened. The crisis hadn't destroyed what they were building. It had clarified it. Stability arrived quietly, not as relief, not as celebration, but as a subtle loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying every single day. The new job began on a Monday morning that looked unremarkable from the outside. Same alarm, same breakfast routine, same walk to school. But something inside him had shifted. This job didn't ask him to be exceptional. It asked him to be present, consistent, reliable. The hours were predictable, the expectations clear. The work didn't ignite him, but it didn't drain him either. It existed in a middle space he had forgotten was possible. When he picked his child up from school that afternoon, they noticed immediately. "You're early," they said, eyes wide with surprise. "Yeah," he replied, smiling. "I thought we could walk home." They did, slowly, stopping to look at nothing in particular. Leaves, dogs, cracks in the sidewalk, ordinary things that somehow felt precious. That night, as he tucked them into bed, his child asked a question that caught him off guard. "Are you going to be tired forever?" He paused, then answered honestly, "No, I don't think so." They nodded, satisfied, and rolled over, already halfway to sleep. He sat there a moment longer, letting the quiet settle. She felt the change too, though it came with a different texture. The pause she had promised herself was harder than expected. Without work to justify every hour, she became acutely aware of how often she had used productivity to avoid stillness. Silence invited questions she had postponed for years. Who was she without urgency? She filled her days carefully at first, reading, walking, volunteering her expertise without committing fully. She said no more often than yes. She learned the discomfort of not being needed immediately. And slowly something softened. She stopped measuring her worth in outcomes, stopped checking headlines for relevance, stopped rehearsing defenses for choices she had already made. When they met now, it wasn't to solve problems. Sometimes it was coffee, sometimes a walk, sometimes sitting in companionable silence while his child played nearby, occasionally interrupting with observations that made them both laugh. The child warmed to her naturally, without ceremony. They asked questions, they told stories, they accepted her presence without expectation, which felt like a gift she hadn't earned but treasured deeply. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table helping with homework, she caught him watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing. Just noticing." The consulting work didn't disappear entirely. Months later, a small organization reached out again, a nonprofit struggling with burnout, staff turnover, and leadership exhaustion. They wanted advice, not transformation, not disruption, just guidance. She forwarded the message to him with a simple note. No pressure, just information. He read it carefully, then set it aside. Days passed. Then one evening after dinner, he brought it up. "I've been thinking," he said. She looked up, attentive but neutral. "I don't want to build something big," he continued. "I don't want another all-consuming project, but maybe there's room for something small, limited, on our terms." Her breath caught slightly, though she kept her voice steady. "What would that look like?" "Boundaries," he said. "Clear ones. No late nights, no emergencies that aren't real, and if it ever starts costing too much, we stop." She nodded slowly. "I can do that." "Can you?" he asked gently. She met his gaze. "Yes." They agreed to take one project, just one. It didn't feel like ambition, it felt like curiosity. Time passed in measured steps. The work they did together was careful, restrained. They helped organizations redesign workloads, rethink leadership expectations, create systems that acknowledge human limits. They turned down clients who wanted miracles. They walked away when demands crept beyond what they had agreed. Sometimes that choice scared him. Sometimes it disappointed her, but each time they talked it through. The work didn't define them, it supported them. At home, life found a new rhythm. His child's health improved steadily. Laughter returned more easily. School projects were completed without tears. Evenings became something to look forward to instead of endure. One night, after his child had gone to bed, he and she sat on the couch, sharing a quiet moment that felt unremarkable in the best possible way. I used to think success meant never needing anyone, she said suddenly. He smiled faintly. I used to think it meant surviving, no matter the cost. They looked at each other. Funny how wrong we were, he said. She nodded, and how necessary that wrongness was. The conversation they had been avoiding arrived naturally, without drama. They were walking through the park, his child running ahead, when she slowed her pace. I've been wondering something, she said. He waited. What are we doing? She asked. I don't mean practically, I mean us. He stopped walking. The question didn't scare him the way it once might have. It felt earned. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know what I don't want. Which is? She asked. I don't want rescue, he said, or sacrifice, or anything that asks one of us to disappear for the other. She nodded, eyes steady. Neither do I. They stood there, the sound of their child's laughter drifting back toward them. What if, she said slowly, we let this be what it is, something that grows only as much as it should? He considered that. I'd like that, he said. She smiled, not wide, not triumphant. Real. The moment that sealed it came unexpectedly. A school event, a small performance. His child stood on a makeshift stage, nervous but determined. He sat in the audience, heart full, camera forgotten in his lap. She sat beside him. When the performance ended, applause filled the room. His child scanned the crowd, spotted them, and beamed. Later, as they walked home, hand in hand with the child between them, they spoke quietly. I used to miss things like this, he said. Not physically, mentally. She glanced at him. I used to believe they didn't matter. They shared a look that held years of unspoken understanding. That night, after his child fell asleep, he stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. She joined him. Do you regret it? He asked. Walking away from what you built? She thought for a moment. No, she said. I regret how long it took me to realize what I was building for. He nodded. I don't feel saved, he said quietly, and that feels important. She smiled softly. Neither do I. They stood there together, not clinging, not afraid, simply present. The future didn't unfold with grand gestures. There was no proposal, no dramatic declaration, no moment that demanded an audience. Instead, there were choices, small, consistent, intentional. They chose honesty over momentum, presence over performance, enough over more. And in doing so, they built something rare, a life that didn't require someone else to lose in order to win, a partnership that didn't depend on imbalance, a future shaped not by fear, but by care. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, his child looked up and asked casually, Are you staying? She paused, then knelt to meet their eyes. If that's okay with you, she said. The child considered this carefully, then smiled. Yeah, I think so. Later, when the apartment was quiet again, she turned to him. That was big, she said softly. He nodded. It was. Are you okay? She asked. He took her hand, grounding himself in the reality of the moment. Yes, he said, I really am. And for the first time in a long time, he knew it was true. In the end, nothing about their lives looked extraordinary from the outside. There was no dramatic triumph, no headline-worthy transformation, no moment where everything suddenly became easy. The apartment was still modest, the work was still work. The world outside remained uncertain, unpredictable, and often unfair. But inside that uncertainty, something fundamental had changed. A single father who once measured his worth by survival learned that being present was not a weakness, but a form of courage. He stopped chasing the idea that endurance alone made him strong and discovered that choosing peace for himself and for his child was an act of love far greater than sacrifice. A woman who once defined herself by control and outcomes learned that leadership without humanity was hollow. Walking away from power did not make her smaller. It stripped away what no longer fit and revealed who she had been all along. She didn't lose herself when she stepped back. She finally met herself. They did not save each other. They did something harder. They stood beside each other without asking the other to disappear, to shrink, or to carry more than they could hold. They chose honesty over heroism, balance over ambition, enough over endless wanting. And in that choice, a child grew safer, lighter, more seen. A home became calmer. A future stopped feeling like a threat. The story doesn't end with certainty because real life rarely does. It ends with intention, with two adults who understand that love is not proven by how much you give up, but by how carefully you protect what matters. Sometimes the bravest decision isn't to fight harder or climb higher. Sometimes it's to step back, breathe, and build a life that doesn't require anyone to break. And sometimes that quiet choice changes everything.